Keanu Reeves thought it was just another quiet night until he found a trembling note on his windshield that read, "Thank you for saving my daughter's life." He couldn't remember doing it, but the letter claimed a storm, a broken car, and a girl who planned to die. In a moment, he almost drove past. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Keanu stepped out of the quiet community center into the cool coastal night, the last echoes of applause still faint in his ears as the door closed behind him. The town was nearly silent now, the ocean hidden somewhere beyond dark rooftops. Its presence felt only in the salt-heavy air and the distant hush of waves. A single row of streetlights flickered along the empty road, casting long, broken shadows across the cracked pavement. His pickup truck waited beneath the farthest light, its once black paint dulled by dust and time, its shape familiar and comforting in a world that rarely allowed him to feel unnoticed. He walked alone, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders heavy with the quiet exhaustion that came after crowds and cameras and constant expectations. Tonight had been about helping others, about raising money and hope and attention for people he would never meet. And yet, as he crossed the lot, he felt the familiar pull of solitude calling him back to himself. Then he saw it, a folded piece of cream-colored paper tucked beneath the driver's side windshield wiper, its pale edge catching the light as if it had been placed there with intention. He stopped short, a sudden unease running through him. This town was quiet. This lot had been nearly empty when he arrived. No flyers, no advertisements, no signatures from fans waited on his truck. This was something else. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, and reached out with slow caution, sliding the paper free. It was heavier than it looked, folded neatly, the surface smooth beneath his fingertips. For a moment he simply stood there, holding it without opening it, a strange tension building in his chest that made no sense, yet felt undeniable. Then he unfolded it. The first line seemed to rise off the page and strike him without mercy. "You saved my daughter's life." The air left his lungs in a sharp, silent breath. His eyes scanned the words again as if his mind refused to accept them. Saved a life. Daughter. He searched his memory in a rush of images and faces and moments he barely remembered anymore, but nothing came fast enough to explain this sentence now burning into him. His hands began to tremble. He forced himself to keep reading every line, pulling him deeper into a story he did not yet understand, until his vision blurred and the streetlight above him fractured into soft halos of light. The final line undid him completely. "Thank you for giving her a reason to live." The paper shook in his grasp, carrying the weight of a hidden life that suddenly felt terrifyingly real now. Keanu stood frozen beside the truck, the cold air brushing against his face, as if trying to wake him from a moment that did not feel real. The letter trembled in his hands, the quiet parking lot now feeling too wide, too empty, as though the world had pulled back and left him alone with words that refused to loosen their grip. He lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the driver's seat, the door creaking softly as it opened, and rested his forearms on his knees, staring down at the paper as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. "You saved my daughter's life," the sentence repeated in his mind with relentless force. He had stopped for people before. Flat tires, lost tourists, strangers in trouble. None of it felt heroic, just human, just what anyone should do. But this was different. This was claiming something enormous, something irreversible, something that could not be undone or misunderstood without consequence. He read the lines again, slower this time, absorbing the careful tone, the respectful distance, the grief and gratitude folded into every word. The writer did not use dramatic language. There was no exaggeration, only quiet certainty. She spoke of a night long ago during a storm, a highway, a broken-down car, a girl who had nothing left inside her, and a stranger who stopped. With every detail, a faint pressure began building behind his eyes, as if a memory long sealed away was struggling to find its way back to the surface. Rain, dark road, cold hands, a voice that barely carried through the noise of wind. The fragments brushed against him, but refused to fully form. His chest tightened. He reached the final sentence again, reading it for the third time, as if it might explain everything he still could not grasp. Thank you for giving her a reason to live. His throat closed. The weight of that sentence pressed against every quiet doubt he had ever carried about whether his presence in the world truly mattered beyond screens and fame and distant strangers who applauded him from afar. This was different. This was private. This was personal. This was a life claimed back from the edge, attributed to a moment he could barely remember. The streetlight flickered above him, dipping the world briefly into shadow before returning in pale yellow pulses. The truck door hung open beside him, its worn interior smelling faintly of dust and old leather, grounding him in a reality that suddenly felt unsteady. He wiped his face once, surprised to feel moisture on his fingers, and let out a slow, controlled breath that barely held together. Somewhere inside his chest, a quiet fear began to grow, not of danger, but of understanding what this letter was truly asking him to confront. Because if it was true, if even one part of it was real, then a forgotten choice he had made in silence years ago had altered the course of an entire life without him ever knowing it. Keanu folded the letter slowly, his fingers stiff as if they no longer fully belonged to him, and placed it carefully on the passenger seat like something fragile and sacred. He remained there in silence, the open truck door framing the quiet night as the distant ocean breathed somewhere beyond the darkness. He felt as though time had paused around him, the noise of the world muffled, leaving only the echo of that single sentence repeating inside his chest. You saved my daughter's life. He searched again through the scattered corridors of his memory, trying to force an image into focus, but only shadows answered him. He remembered storms. He remembered rain that blinded the road. He remembered stopping for strangers without hesitation because it felt wrong not to. But a girl, a daughter, a life pulled back from ending, that remained hidden just beyond reach. His chest tightened with a mix of awe and unease. If this was true, then a moment he had nearly forgotten had never forgotten him. It had traveled forward through years, grown roots in another family, and finally found him again in the quietest place imaginable. The streetlight above flickered once more, and for a second his reflection appeared faint in the truck window, older, heavier, marked by time and questions he could no longer ignore. He reached for the steering wheel but did not turn the key. The engine stayed silent. Part of him was still standing on a dark highway somewhere long ago beside a stranger's car in the middle of a storm he could not yet remember. The letter did not feel like an ending. It felt like a doorway opening behind him without warning. And somewhere beyond that door was a girl whose life continued because he had stopped. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath, knowing with sudden certainty that whatever waited in that hidden memory would change him all over again. Keanu finally closed the truck door, shutting out the empty parking lot, yet the silence inside felt even louder than before. He did not start the engine, did not move at all, only sat breathing slowly as if motion might scatter the fragile weight now resting on the passenger seat beside him. Outside, the coastal night stretched wide and quiet, and far beyond the dark rooftops, he could hear the faint hush of waves, steady and distant, like a reminder that the world was still moving without him. This was the life he guarded whenever the lights faded and the crowds vanished. The late drives, the empty roads, the slow rhythm of tires against asphalt that allowed him to exist without expectation, without questions, without 1,000 eyes looking through him. He lived quietly on purpose, a small home near the coast, a simple kitchen, a worn couch, and a motorcycle that waited patiently for nights when sleep refused to come at all. Fame followed him like a shadow he could never fully outrun, but he learned where to hide from it. Back roads, nameless diners, quiet gas stations, places where no one expected anything from him. The truck was part of that hiding, scratched and faithful, never asking for attention, carrying the dust of ordinary miles. Instead of red carpets, its steering wheel shaped by years of unremarkable hands gripping it through ordinary days and nights. He reached for the folded letter, lifted it again, and read the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to understand, but the meaning stayed heavy and unyielding in his chest. "You saved my daughter's life." The sentence echoed again louder now, threading through everything he believed about chance and consequence, threading through old doubts about whether his presence ever truly mattered beyond the surface of things. He searched memory again, slower this time, combing through years of highways, weather faces, and fleeting conversations, stopping at moments that felt close, but never quite reached the shape of truth. Storms returned to him only as fragments blurred curtains of rain cracked pavement. Cold hands. A voice too soft to carry in wind, all of it slipping away when he tried to grasp it whole. He had lived many lives inside one body, actor, stranger, donor, wanderer, and yet the version of himself that haunted him now was another thing entirely, a man standing beside a decision he could not remember making. He lowered the letter into his lap, exhaled slowly, and allowed the weight of the night to settle over him, feeling the familiar pull of solitude wrestle with the ache of being needed in a way he did not understand. Keanu let the letter rest against his thigh and leaned his head back against the seat, staring up through the windshield at the dim streetlight flickering above him. Its wavering glow reflected faintly in the glass, like a reminder of instability he could not quite place. This was the quiet he trusted, the kind that did not ask questions or demand answers, the kind that allowed him to breathe without explanation. His days were still filled with noise, with people who wanted pieces of him, who spoke his name with familiarity they had never earned. But the nights belonged to him alone. Late drives down empty coastal roads, long rides on his motorcycle when sleep refused to come, coffee at diners where no one recognized his face in the low light, anonymous donations sent without signatures, generosity that required no applause. This was how he lived now, quietly, deliberately, as if each hidden kindness balanced the public chaos he could never fully escape. He had built his life this way after learning how easily the world could take more than it gave, after learning that solitude could sometimes feel safer than connection. Yet none of it had prepared him for this letter. None of his routines had armor for a stranger reaching back through time to place a life in his hands without warning. He lifted the paper again and reread it slowly, his eyes moving over the careful handwriting, as if tracing the outline of a face he could not see. The mother's words were steady, grateful, certain, not desperate or dramatic, certain. That certainty unsettled him more than any accusation could have. If she was right, then a moment he barely remembered had become the foundation of someone else's entire existence. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper, feeling the soft resistance of the fold, grounding himself in something tangible. His truck had carried him through years of quiet generosity, through storms and sunrises, and long stretches of empty road where no one waited at the end. It had never carried a secret like this before. The engine remained silent, the keys resting heavy in his pocket, as if the truck itself understood that this moment could not be rushed. He thought about the lives that passed beside him unnoticed every day, the faces at stoplights, the strangers at gas stations, the people who crossed his path for seconds and vanished again forever. Somewhere in those forgotten intersections, this girl's life had split in two. One path leading toward ending, the other toward something he could not yet name. And he had been there. Or so the letter claimed. His chest tightened again as doubt and wonder twisted together inside him. He had always believed that meaning was something you chose, something you built slowly with intention. This suggested something else entirely, that meaning could be planted without consent and grow unnoticed until it returned years later, with weight enough to bend your knees. He lowered his gaze to the words again, the final line waiting with the same quiet force as before, and for the first time the weight of not remembering felt heavier than the weight of knowing ever could. Keanu finally drew a slow breath and straightened in the seat, the ache in his chest dull but persistent, like a bruise pressed from the inside. He lifted the letter once more, smoothing the crease with care, and read it again from the beginning to the end, without stopping this time. The words did not soften. They did not explain themselves. They simply remained. He thought about the ways he chose quiet over attention, how he slipped through the edges of rooms instead of standing at their center, how he rode alone at night to feel smaller than the world. The truck had always been his moving shelter, a place where he could be no one in particular, just a man and a road and the steady hum of an engine. Tonight it felt like a witness. He kept seeing the same unfinished images rising and fading in his mind, rain against glass, a shoulder hunched against cold, a voice breaking on words he could not hear. He pressed his palm flat to the steering wheel as if touch might steady memory into shape. Outside, a gull cried once and fell silent. The town slept on, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside one parked truck. He imagined the woman who had written the letter, her hands steady or trembling as she formed each word, the years of waiting folded between each line. He imagined a daughter grown into a life he could not picture, carrying his forgotten moment like a secret heartbeat. The thought made him feel both impossibly small and unbearably present at the same time. Minutes passed without him noticing. The streetlight flickered again, briefly dimming the cab before returning with its tired glow. He felt the weariness of public life sink back into his shoulders, the constant giving, the smiling, the careful distance that kept him from being fully seen. This letter had crossed that distance without permission. It had found him not on a stage or in a crowd, but alone, where he hid the parts of himself no one applauded. He folded it carefully again and held it in both hands like something that asked to be weighed. His throat tightened as the question he had tried to avoid finally formed in his mind. If this was true, what else had he forgotten that still lived on in someone else's life? He closed his eyes and listened to his own breathing until it slowed. Then in the quiet cab, with the ocean far away and the town asleep, he whispered the only words that felt honest. "I do not remember saving anyone." He stayed unmoving, knowing the night had marked him forever in silence. Keanu unfolded the letter again with careful hands, this time forcing himself to read every word, slowly, as if giving the story space to breathe would finally allow it to exist inside him. The handwriting was steady and precise, each line shaped with quiet intention rather than urgency. "My name is Margaret Hill," it began, "and I am the mother of a girl whose life you changed on a night you probably no longer remember. 14 years ago, on a rain-flooded highway in Oregon, my daughter Emily was 17 years old and had driven into the storm, believing it would be her last drive." Keanu felt the words tighten around his chest as the letter continued without exaggeration, without blame, only the unfiltered truth of a mother who had waited years for this moment. Margaret wrote of abuse that had lived behind closed doors of years. Emily spent learning to stay silent to survive of school hallways that offered no refuge from cruelty of friendships that disappeared when she needed them. Most of a father who vanished and a mother who worked until exhaustion to keep food on the table, never realizing how deeply her daughter was disappearing inside herself. She wrote of the night Emily took the car without saying goodbye, drove into heavy rain with shaking hands, and waited on the shoulder of the highway for the courage to be gone. The storm that night was violent winds bending the roadside trees, rain swallowing the road until the lines vanished beneath moving water. "You could have passed her by," Margaret wrote, "and none of us would be alive in the way we are now. But you did not. You stopped. You stepped into that storm for a girl the world had already taught to feel invisible. You stayed with her for over an hour in the dark and the rain. You gave her your jacket when she would not stop shaking. You listened when she finally spoke. You did not rush her. You did not minimize her pain. You did not tell her she was wrong for feeling the way she did. You told her she mattered when she believed she did not. You told her storms pass even when they feel endless. You told her that being tired did not mean being finished." Keanu felt the pressure behind his eyes deepen as Margaret described the moments that followed, how help arrived, how Emily was driven home, wrapped in a stranger's jacket, how she walked through the front door alive when her mother had already begun preparing for loss without knowing it. Margaret wrote that it took years for Emily to confess what that night truly meant. Years before the truth of the cliff she stood on finally surfaced in therapy and trembling conversations that left no one unchanged. By the time Keanu reached the last lines of this page, his breath was shallow and unsteady. The story no longer distant, no longer abstract but real, and waiting for him to accept it. Margaret's words continued without raising their voice, yet every sentence carried the weight of a life that almost was not. She wrote of the months that followed the storm, when Emily moved through the house like a fragile shadow alive in body, yet unsure how to inhabit the space of being alive at all. Therapy became a doorway she did not want to open and yet could not avoid. Some nights were nearly as dark as the one on the highway. Some mornings came with a fragile hope she did not trust yet, but could not fully reject. The jacket followed her through those early months, like armor she did not understand, worn on difficult days folded beside her bed, on nights when the memory pressed too closely. It became proof that someone had seen her and chosen to stay. The letter moved forward through time with deliberate care, describing Emily's slow return to school, the long climb through missed lessons and whispered judgments, the hours spent in a counselor's office learning to speak without apology for needing help. Margaret wrote of the day Emily volunteered at a youth crisis line. For the first time, her voice shaking with nerves, but steady enough to hold another trembling voice on the other end. That first, saved stranger broke something open inside her that could not be sealed again. From that moment on, she no longer wanted to survive only for herself. She wanted to survive for the one standing where she once stood. The letter told of scholarships earned through persistence rather than brilliance, of sleepless nights over textbooks and self-doubt of the day Emily was accepted into a counseling program with a letter that made her sob in the kitchen while her mother held her standing up. Margaret wrote of the quiet pride in watching her daughter become someone who walked willingly into rooms filled with pain instead of running from them. Years passed inside those lines. Emily fell in love with a man who learned her scars without fear, who married her not to rescue her, but to walk beside her. Their wedding was small and unsteady with tears, and Margaret noticed Emily carrying something close to her heart beneath the dress stitched into the lining with care only she seemed to notice. Emily became a mother not long after holding her newborn with trembling hands and whispering promises she once thought she had no right to make. At the same time, she carried her work deeper into the world, sitting with teens whose eyes mirrored her own from long ago, walking with them through nights that felt unendurable and mornings that felt uncertain. The letter named no numbers at first, only lives, only faces, only stories, until Margaret finally wrote what Keanu could hardly absorb. Dozens of children are still alive because my daughter learned how to stay alive from you. As he read those words, the truck seemed to shrink around him, the silence tightening until even the ocean felt impossibly far away. The final page of the letter felt heavier than the rest, as if the years themselves had gathered inside the last few lines and waited there. Margaret wrote that Emily now worked as a trauma counselor for adolescents, sitting every day with teenagers who believed their pain had no ending, listening to stories that echoed her own in different voices. She wrote that her daughter returned home many nights emotionally emptied, yet unbroken, still choosing to go back the next morning with the same quiet resolve that once kept her alive inside a stranger's truck. She wrote that Emily's marriage was built on patience, on honesty, on the shared understanding that healing did not move in straight lines, and that motherhood had awakened a fierce devotion to protecting young life in ways Margaret had never imagined. She wrote that the jacket never left Emily's reach for long. It traveled with her through dorm rooms and first apartments, through grief and joy and collapse and rebuilding. It was there on the day she passed her certification exam. It was there when her first patient survived a crisis. It was there on the night she brought her newborn home and whispered, "You are safe," into the dark. Margaret wrote that it became more than fabric. It became a reminder. It became proof that mercy was real even on roads where hope felt impossible. Then came the final lines that undid him completely. "Emily never forgot your name," she wrote. "She searched for you for years, but never dared force her way into your life. She feared that finding you might somehow diminish the miracle that day had become. But now she feels strong enough to say thank you, not from need, but from truth. You did not just save her life, you shaped the life she chose to build afterward." And then the last sentence waited like a quiet revelation meant only for him. "She kept your jacket all these years. It hangs in her office." Keanu lowered the letter slowly, as if the words had changed the weight of air around him. The world outside his windshield felt distant, now unreal, as if he were suspended between years that no longer obeyed time. Inside his chest, the story rearranged everything he thought he knew about forgotten moments. A jacket he no longer remembered giving away now lived as something sacred in a room he had never seen. A girl whose face remained blurred in his memory had become a woman carrying hundreds of lives forward through days he would never witness. His hands trembled again as the full truth settled inside him without permission. He had not just crossed paths with pain. He had altered its direction without knowing it. The truck remained still. The tide whispered somewhere beyond darkness. And in the quiet aftermath of the letter, Keanu understood that the life he thought he had merely passed had been walking beside him all along, waiting for him to finally see it. The moment Keanu lowered the letter, the memory broke loose without warning. Not as a clear picture at first, but as sensation whined against metal rain striking glass with violent rhythm, darkness pressing in from every direction at once. His breath caught as the sound of that storm seemed to replace the quiet ocean outside his truck now. He saw again the highway stretching through black water, the faint white lines swallowed and reappearing beneath rushing rain. The world narrowed to the fragile reach of headlights cutting through chaos. The coastal storm had been vicious that night, the kind that erased distance and depth, where the road felt less like a path and more like something that might vanish beneath the tires at any moment. His hands tightened on an invisible steering wheel as the image sharpened further. He remembered the curve in the road where the trees bent toward one another like silhouettes fighting the wind. He remembered the sudden flash of hazard lights ahead, barely visible through the sheets of rain, blinking weakly like a pulse struggling to stay alive. At first he had thought it was debris, then he realized it was a car. It sat on the shoulder at an awkward angle, too close to rushing water, too still for comfort. His first instinct had been to keep driving. The storm was dangerous. The road was unstable. Visibility was falling fast. He told himself someone else would stop. He told himself help would come quicker if he stayed moving. He remembered the argument forming in the quiet space inside him with surprising clarity now. Just keep going. It is not safe. But then he caught a glimpse through the rain of movement inside the car. Just a shadow at first, a figure slumped forward over the steering wheel, as if pressed down by invisible weight. His foot had lifted from the accelerator without conscious decision. His truck slowed against the will of his own fear. The wipers fought for clarity, dragging arcs through a water that instantly closed again. And then he saw her. Emily at 17, thin shoulders, shaking dark hair plastered to her face, hands locked tightly around the wheel, as if it were the last thing holding her to the world. He remembered stepping out into the storm rain, soaking him instantly, wind tearing at his jacket, the road roaring beneath his feet. He remembered knocking on the glass and watching her flinch as if struck by lightning itself. He remembered her window lowering just a few inches, her voice barely carrying through the rain, fragile and distant at once. "My car will not start," she had said, but now the memory widened with terrible clarity. It was not just mechanical failure in her voice. It was surrender. It was waiting. And in that instant, long before she ever spoke her truth aloud, he had already felt it. She did not break down by accident. The memory deepened, pulling him back into the storm with terrifying precision, as if time had folded in on itself for a moment. He remembered how cold she was when she stepped into the open air, how the rain struck her like needles and made her gasp as she reached his truck, how her hands were shaking so violently he had been afraid she might collapse before the door even closed. He remembered pulling off his jacket without thinking and wrapping it around her shoulders, feeling how thin she felt beneath the wet fabric. How light, how alarmingly fragile. Inside the truck, the storm had sounded even louder for a few seconds, rain hammering the roof, like something trying to break through, wind howling around the doors, as if angry at the shelter they had claimed. He remembered the way she stared at the dashboard, instead of at him. Eyes, hollow lips pressed together in a trembling line, as though any word might shatter something inside her beyond repair. Silence had filled the cab. First, a heavy silence that felt wrong in a place meant for safety. He had tried small words at first, questions about her car, about whether she could call someone about where she was headed. Her answers had been short, detached, drifting in and out of the space between thunderclaps. Then he remembered the moment that still tightened his chest even now. He had asked if she was hurt. She had shaken her head slowly without looking at him and said, "Not like that." The words had settled between them like a truth neither fully understood yet. He had felt it then, the wrongness beneath. What she did say, the exhaustion that had nothing to do with cold or fear. He remembered watching her hands twist together in her lap, fingers trembling, skin pale beneath rainwater. He remembered the way she seemed to be listening not to him or the storm, but to something inside herself that kept pulling her further away. He had waited with her for what felt like a lifetime, as the rain poured and the road swelled with water. He remembered telling her she was safe with him now that she did not have to decide anything in that moment, that all she had to do was breathe and stay. He remembered her finally turning slightly toward him, just enough for the light inside the cab to catch her eyes, and seeing the emptiness there that startled him more than the storm ever could have. It was the look of someone who had already stepped out of the world and was only waiting for the body to follow. Her voice had barely lifted when she spoke again. "I am just so tired," she had said, tired in a way sleep could not touch. And in that moment, without needing to hear anything else, he had understood the truth that now echoed through him again with crushing force. She had not been waiting for a tow truck. She had been waiting to disappear. The memory pressed forward to the moment everything shifted, the moment her silence finally broke open into truth he would never forget. He remembered how the rain softened for just a breath outside the truck, as if the storm itself had paused to listen, how the world narrowed until there were only two people sealed together inside a trembling pocket of light and sound. He had not forced her to speak. He had only waited. And then she had whispered it so quietly he almost missed it beneath the rain. "I do not want to be here anymore." The words landed heavier than thunder. He remembered the way his body reacted before his mind could form a response, how his chest tightened in sudden fear, not for himself but for the girl beside him, who sounded already halfway gone. He remembered turning fully toward her, then seeing the tracks of rain and tears cutting identical paths down her face, seeing how she stared not at him, but at the blank stretch of road beyond the windshield, as if she were already imagining it, without herself. He remembered telling her she did not have to decide anything alone in that moment. He remembered telling her storms lie to people, making them believe what they feel will last forever, when it never does. He remembered her voice breaking when she asked him how he could be so sure. He remembered answering without certainty, but with truth, because I have lived through a few storms myself, and none of them kept their promises. The weight of that simple exchange flooded through him now with unbearable clarity. He remembered the way she had finally looked at him, then really looked at him, as if searching his face for proof that he meant what he said. He remembered offering her his phone number, writing it, with a hand that trembled more than he had expected, telling her she could call any time that being tired did not mean being finished, that it only meant she had carried too much alone for too long. He remembered the way she had nodded slowly, uncertain but no longer unreachable. And now, sitting alone in his truck, years later, with the letter resting heavy in his chest, the full weight of what almost happened came crashing down on him all at once. If he had driven past, if fear had outweighed instinct, if the storm had felt more dangerous than stopping, everything that followed, every life Emily touched, every life that lived because she lived, would have been erased before it ever existed. The realization struck him with both gratitude and terror. He had stood at the edge of an ending without ever knowing it. His breath shook as awe wrapped itself around guilt, not for what he had done, but for how close he had come to not doing it at all. The truck around him felt suddenly very small, as the vastness of that single choice expanded until it filled everything. He bowed his head against the steering wheel and closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the truth that one forgotten stop in a storm had become a turning point for a life he would now carry forever. Keanu stayed with her as the rain battered the truck, counting breaths instead of minutes, feeling the night hover on a fragile edge that could tilt at any sound. Emily's shoulders trembled beneath his jacket, the denim dark with water, her eyes fixed on the blurred windshield as if the world beyond it no longer belonged to her. For a long time she said nothing, and he did not push, letting the silence be a place she could rest instead of a force that chased her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and careful, like glass about to crack. "I did not plan to go home tonight," she said. The truth sat between them, heavy and undeniable. He nodded once, not in approval, not in alarm, only to show that he had heard her. She drew a shallow breath, and the words began to fall in uneven pieces. She told him about a father whose anger had filled rooms and left marks that never fully vanished. She told him about a mother who disappeared one morning with promises that never came back. She told him about school screens that followed her into every room, messages that carved her down in public, and in secret jokes sharpened into weapons by people who never had to see her face. She spoke of the first cut as if it were a misstep, the second as if it were practice, the third as if it were proof that pain could be controlled if nothing else could. She said she felt unnecessary, like a chair no one sat in, like a lamp left on in an empty house. Keanu listened without interrupting, without correcting, without stepping into the space where her words needed to land. He felt the ache of recognition in the quiet places of his own past, the rooms where grief lingered, the long stretches where loneliness felt endless, even in crowds. He told her about loss without detail, about nights when sleep did not come, and mornings that felt impossible to enter. He told her survival was not loud or heroic. On most days that sometimes it was just staying when leaving felt easier. "You do not have to be strong tonight," he said. "Just stay." The storm raged on as if it had not heard him, but something in her breathing shifted, a fraction slower, a fraction steadier. He gave her his number, writing it carefully, as if each digit mattered because it did. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it with gentle certainty. A distant siren cut through the rain at last, then another. He stayed until the lights arrived, until hands took over. The rain eased just enough to reveal the blurred glow of approaching headlights as the first responder vehicle slowed behind them, tires cutting through standing water with controlled urgency. Emily stiffened at the sound, fear filling the sudden space where confession had been, and Keanu turned slightly toward her, without touching, grounding her with presence instead of pressure. "You do not have to explain everything tonight," he said quietly. "You already did the hardest part by staying." She stared at the dash as if it were still pulling her somewhere she no longer wished to go, then whispered, "I was so sure no one would notice if I was gone." The words hit him harder than anything else she had said. He answered without hurry, "People do not always notice the way we need them to. That does not mean they would not be broken by losing you." He told her that pain lies, that loneliness tells a story that feels final, but never is. The responder knocked gently on the window, introducing himself with calm authority, asking if Emily was hurt. She shook her head, uncertain, looking to Keanu again, as if he were still the storm shelter instead of the stranger he truly was. He nodded once, steady and quiet, and she opened the door. Cold air rushed in with the scent of wet road and gasoline. Another responder wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but she still clutched his jacket beneath it, unwilling to let the last safe thing go out. Her mother had not yet arrived. Traffic had been stopped across several miles by flooding, and calls were moving slowly through emergency lines clogged with chaos. Keanu remained beside her, speaking softly about ordinary things, the sound of waves on calm days, The way coffee tasted better after long drives, the strange comfort of knowing dawn always arrives even when you cannot feel it coming. She listened without lifting her head, but her trembling eased only slightly enough for him to see that she was still there with him. When the tow truck finally arrived, its lights reflecting off rivers of rainwater along the highway, Emily looked up at him with eyes still hollow, yet no longer absent. "Do you think I will ever feel different?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a question. She was afraid to believe had an answer. He replied honestly, "I think you will feel many different things, some good, some unbearable, some that make no sense at all. But I also think this is not the last page of your story." When her mother's car pulled up at last through the storm headlights, cutting through fog and rain, Emily flinched again. He reminded her that she was not alone, now that she did not have to pretend strength for anyone tonight. As she stepped forward, still wrapped in borrowed warmth, she turned back once and looked at him as if trying to memorize the proof that someone had stopped. As emergency lights painted the rain in slow red and blue pulses, Keanu watched Emily move toward her mother with hesitant steps every few feet, turning back as if the distance itself were dangerous, and when the older woman wrapped her arms around her daughter, the sound that escaped Emily was not a sob, but a release so deep it seemed to loosen the night. He stayed a short distance away to give them space, rain soaking his hair and jacketless shoulders. The cold finally reaching him now that the crisis had shifted, and he wondered without pride or fear whether he would ever see this girl again, or if this moment would simply dissolve back into the dark. Emily's mother thanked him through shaking breaths, words tumbling over each other with the confusion of shock and gratitude, and Keanu answered with simple assurances that carried no ownership of what had happened, only a quiet insistence that Emily's courage had been the deciding force. When the tow driver finished securing the car and responders cleared the shoulder, the highway resumed its restless motion, water rushing where feet had stood a moment earlier, and Keanu felt the night begin to loosen its grip, as if the storm itself were conceding something had changed. Emily broke free from her mother's arms once more and walked back to him. The borrowed jacket swallowing her small frame eyes, searching his face with a mix of fear and determination, and he met that gaze without urgency, letting her choose how close she needed to be. He pressed the paper with his number into her palm, again slower this time, making sure she felt the weight of it, and he told her that if the night returned inside her, if the silence grew too heavy, she could break it with a call and he would answer. She nodded, not with certainty, but with permission to try. And in that small movement he saw the fragile geometry of survival take shape, not as a promise of happiness, but as the willingness to step into another hour and then another without deciding the ending in advance. As she turned back toward her mother, Keanu felt the strange sorrow of letting go of someone he had only just begun to know, coupled with the steadier relief of watching her re-enter the world, rather than leave it the rain thinning to a cold mist around them. He returned to his truck at last, hands shaking, as the reality of what had nearly happened settled into him like delayed thunder, and he sat there until the road cleared, until their taillights vanished, until the storm moved on, carrying with it the night that changed everything. 6. Emily did not wake up healed the morning after the storm. She woke up confused, frightened by the fact that she had stayed unsettled by the borrowed jacket, folded at the foot of her bed like evidence that the night had been real. Her mother sat beside her with red, tired eyes and spoke softly about therapy doctors, steps that felt overwhelming but necessary. Emily agreed with a numb nod that carried no belief yet, but did carry a promise to keep breathing. The first weeks were a blur of offices and careful questions of silence, broken only by tears she did not understand how to stop. Some days she went, some days she refused to get out of the car. Twice she quit entirely and told herself it was useless, that nothing inside her could be repaired. Each time the storm returned in quiet forms, long nights shaking hands, that same sentence repeating in her mind that she did not belong. And each time another sentence rose against it, steady and unspectacular: "You do not have to be strong tonight, just stay." She stayed. Months passed like uneven steps across broken ground, Medication came and went. Trust came slower. She learned that survival was not a single choice, but a series of smaller ones made when no one was watching. At school, the whispers did not vanish, but their power changed as she found words for what had once felt unspeakable. She carried the jacket in her backpack for a year, pulling it across her shoulders on days when the hallway felt too narrow to walk through. During one especially quiet winter, she saw a flyer for a crisis hotline taped to a library door and tore it down without knowing why. Training nights were awkward and frightening, her voice shaking as she learned how to listen without fixing. On her third shift, the line went silent for a long breath, and then a younger girl whispered that she had taken pills and did not want to be alone. Emily felt the old darkness surge and then steady as she heard herself say, "Stay with me. We will stay together." The ambulance arrived in time. The girl lived. That night, Emily cried in the parking lot until dawn and understood something had changed direction inside her. The work was slow and unpaid, and she nearly quit again when exhaustion returned, but the memory of that stranger in the rain had become a quiet compass she did not question anymore. By the time she enrolled in community college, she no longer told people she planned no future. She said she was thinking about counseling and felt surprised to hear it. College did not arrive as a victory, it arrived as a risk. Emily sat in the back row of her first psychology class, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, certain she did not belong among students who spoke with confidence about futures that felt unreal to her. The first semester nearly broke her. A professor's raised voice sent her trembling out of the room one afternoon, and she did not return for 3 days. Old urges resurfaced with frightening familiarity. Sleep vanished. Food lost meaning. Silence grew loud again. She withdrew from 2 classes and told herself she had tried and failed just as she always did. But during one night when quitting felt easiest, she pulled the jacket from the back of her closet and wrapped it around herself as if warmth could speak. The words returned quietly. "Just stay." She re-enrolled the following term with lighter weight on her schedule and heavier weight in her heart. The hotline became her anchor. She picked up extra overnight shifts when insomnia refused to loosen its grip. She learned how to guide breathing across trembling phone lines. She learned that pauses could save lives. On one shift, a boy no older than 15 said he was sitting on the bathroom floor with a blade in his hand, and no one on the other side of the door who cared. Emily stayed with him for 70 minutes while responders traced his signal. When the line finally went dead, she sobbed into her sleeves and walked out into daylight feeling both broken and unbreakable at the same time. That was the moment she chose her direction without retreat. She transferred into a counseling program with determination that frightened even her. Finances faltered. She worked nights at a grocery store and weekends at a diner where customers watched her like storm clouds moving past without knowing her name. There were more setbacks, a relapse that lasted 2 weeks, a failed exam that nearly sent her spiraling. Each time, the same sentence carried her back to the next hour without ceremony. She did not call the number she had been given. She did not need to. The voice already lived inside her. By her final year, she supervised outreach groups at local schools, speaking in rooms where students stared at the floor the way she once had. She never told them everything. She told them only enough to let them believe survival was not an impossible language. On the night she received her acceptance into a graduate trauma counseling program, she stood in her kitchen holding the letter and shaking so badly she had to sit on the floor. Her mother cried quietly at the table like someone afraid to celebrate too loudly. Emily did not sleep. She waited for morning and walked outside into it, jacket over her shoulders, understanding at last that she was building a future one fragile decision at a time. Graduate school tested Emily in ways she had not anticipated, not with cruelty, but with relentless exposure to other people's pain. And there were evenings she returned to her small apartment, so hollowed out by the weight of stories that she lay on the floor staring at the ceiling until the ache inside her loosened. Some classmates dropped out before the first year ended, unable to separate their own wounds from the work they hoped to do. and Emily nearly joined them once, during a winter when 3 clients relapsed in a single week. She learned supervision was not weakness, but survival, learned to ask for help without surrendering her progress, learned that boundaries were not walls, but bridges that kept both sides standing. During her internship at a youth center, she met a girl who refused to speak for 6 sessions, and then suddenly asked in a whisper if wanting to disappear made her a bad person, and Emily answered with the only truth she had ever trusted, that pain did not make monsters, only human beings in need of shelter. On the night that girl returned 1 year later with a certificate of completion and asked to hug her, in the hallway Emily felt the quiet echo of the storm ripple outward again in a way she could not describe. By the time she graduated, her mother sat in the crowd, clutching the old jacket folded across her lap like a relic from another life. And when Emily crossed the stage, she did not feel triumphant, only steady in a way that made her breathe differently. She married the following spring, not in extravagance, but in calm, choosing vows that spoke more about patience than romance. And her husband learned quickly that her nights sometimes carried the past like a shadow that never quite lifted. Their first child arrived 2 years later in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear and promise, and Emily held that small life against her chest, shaking with a gratitude too large for language. She returned to work 3 months later because she knew what it meant to disappear from rooms where people were waiting to survive, and her supervisors worried but did not stop her because her presence mattered in ways no policy could measure. She opened her own office 5 years after graduation in a modest building beside a coffee shop that brewed too loud and smelled like safety to her, and she hung the jacket on a hook beside the door without explanation. Teens noticed it and asked. She never told them about storms or highways or strangers. She only told them that someone once stayed when she thought no one would, and that staying was something they were allowed to learn too. And quietly, without spectacle, the girl who once waited to vanish became a woman who waited with others until the dark loosened its grip. Keanu sat in the quiet of his truck long after the memory of Emily's rebuilding settled into something steady inside his chest, the folded letter resting against the console like a weight that had not yet reached the floor. The ocean whispered beyond the dark, indifferent to the storm it once carried, and his phone lay heavy in his hand, as though it too understood what it was about to bridge. He had traced the number at the bottom of the letter more times than he cared to admit, fingers hesitating on the final digit, as if calling would somehow turn the story into something irreversible. His breath moved slowly in and out as he told himself that the woman on the other end of that line had already waited years to speak, and that silence now would only extend a distance he no longer wanted between them. The call rang once, then twice, then a third time that stretched thin as doubt began to rise again before a soft voice finally answered with a cautious hello that carried both hope and restraint. He gave his name quietly, almost apologetically, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full to breaking. When Margaret spoke again, her voice shook so badly she had to stop and breathe before continuing. And in that small pause, he felt the truth of the letter settle fully into the space between them. She did not ask him to explain. She only thanked him again and again, the same sentence breaking apart under the weight of emotion she had carried too long alone. She confirmed the storm without hesitation, described the night in brief strokes that matched too well with the memory he could no longer deny. And when he asked if Emily truly lived because he stopped, Margaret did not soften the answer. Yes, she said simply, as if there were no other language sufficient. He closed his eyes at the certainty of it, the quiet inside the truck stretching wide enough to hold the sound of a life he had altered without knowing. Margaret told him Emily had never stopped talking about the stranger who stayed, that his words had followed her through school and training rooms and hospital halls, that the jacket became a symbol no one else fully understood, but many felt. She told him Emily named her daughter after hope, because the storm taught her that mercy had a face, and that face was a man who chose not to leave. Keanu listened without interruption, his chest tightening with every thread that tied the past to the present more firmly than he ever expected. When Margaret finally invited him to meet them, Her voice trembled again, not from fear, but from the quiet wonder of a moment she once thought might never arrive, and he found his own voice answering before he had time to question the weight of yes. The call did not end quickly after his agreement, because once the first bridge was crossed, both sides lingered in the middle of it, as if afraid the space might collapse if they moved too fast. Margaret spoke of Emily as she was, now not as a summary, but as a living presence, a woman who laughed easily yet still carried quiet gravity in her eyes, a counselor whose office stayed lit long after the last appointment, because someone always needed one more moment before going back to the world. Keanu listened to details that felt impossibly tender for a life he had touched only once, hearing about the way Emily still folded sweaters with care, about the way she ran her thumb along the inside seam of his old jacket on nights when cases followed her home, about the way she whispered thank you to no one in particular before difficult sessions. When he asked about her family, Margaret told him about a husband who learned to listen before he learned to speak, about a little girl who asked hard questions with wide eyes, about a home that was small but steady and filled with the sound of healing in everyday forms. The words landed slowly inside him, each one a quiet echo of a future he had never imagined when he pulled over beside a storm. When Margaret finally paused, her breath caught on something she had not yet said, and when it came, it was softer than everything before it. She told him that Emily still carried guilt for surviving, that even now, some nights she stared at the ceiling and wondered why she was chosen when others were not, and that the jacket helped only because it reminded her that someone once saw her as worth choosing. Keanu felt that confession settle in his chest with a sharp humility that no applause had ever summoned, and for a moment he had no response that felt adequate. His voice returned only after a long breath, and when it did, it carried no defense, only a fragile honesty that had waited years to be spoken. He told Margaret that he had almost driven past that night, that there was a moment of calculation he was ashamed to admit, a second where danger, exhaustion, and convenience nearly outweighed compassion. The admission fell between them with neither judgment nor reassurance attached to it, only truth. Margaret did not interrupt him. When he finished, she answered with a tenderness that broke something open in him, telling him that the measure of a moment was not found in hesitation, but in the choice that followed it. Her gratitude deepened not in spite of his doubt, but because he acted beyond it. By the time silence returned, it no longer felt empty. It felt earned. They spoke then of a place and a time, neither of them rushing to frame it perfectly, trusting instead that the right shape would find them when it was ready to exist in the world. As the call edged toward goodbye, Keanu felt the unfamiliar hesitation of someone afraid that silence might erase what had just been born. Margaret sensed it too and lingered with one final offering, her voice steady despite tremor beneath it. She told him Emily had written the note herself, but could not bear the vulnerability of leaving it in her own handwriting. Margaret had simply placed it where Emily knew he would find it, without confrontation or pressure. The intention had never been to demand anything from him, only to return the moment that began everything. Keanu closed his eyes as she spoke, the truck interior fading into something older and louder. He asked quietly when Emily would be ready to meet him, unsure if he deserved that closeness yet. Margaret answered that readiness had waited years already, and fear was the only remaining distance. They chose a morning 3 days away, a simple cafe near the coast where storms rarely stayed long. When they ended the call, neither rushed the final word, both acknowledging a gravity that demanded care. The line went dead, but the sound of Margaret's breathing seemed to remain in the cab beside him. Keanu lowered the phone slowly, as if setting down something fragile that might crack if moved too quickly. Outside, the streetlight flickered again, rain beginning in thin needles against the hood and windshield. He stayed seated without starting the engine, the letter resting in his open palm like a quiet weight. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm as the realization kept widening inside him without permission. There was no triumph in what he felt, only humility shaped like shock and gratitude tangled together. He imagined the woman Emily had become and felt the distance of years collapse into a single breath. The weight of what almost happened pressed harder than the miracle of what did. Keanu leaned forward until his forehead touched the steering wheel, rain blurring the world beyond glass. The whisper escaped him before he realized he had formed it into words. He said that he almost did not stop that night, and the confession sounded like both sin and prayer. The engine remained silent as he sat suspended between the ghost of a storm and the promise of morning. Keanu parked at the edge of the narrow driveway with the engine ticking softly as it cooled the modest coastal house, resting quietly ahead of him with its pale siding, warm window light, and wind chimes whispering faintly above the porch as if the night itself were breathing. He stayed seated for a moment with both hands still on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of 14 invisible years pressing against his chest, each heartbeat steady but unfamiliar. When he finally stepped out, the air carried a subtle scent of salt and cedar, calm and ordinary in a way that made his nerves feel almost intrusive. The porch light glowed steadily as he reached the first step, his boots sounding too loud on the wood, as if announcing a presence he was not sure he deserved. Before he could raise his hand to knock, the door opened. Emily stood there frozen in place, her expression caught between disbelief and recognition, as if time had folded inside her eyes. For one suspended breath, neither of them moved. Then something primal and unpracticed broke through the years. Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him with a firmness that carried both relief and unfinished grief. Keanu held her without thought, the embrace unplanned and necessary, words collapsing under the weight of presence. Her shoulders trembled once against his chest, and he felt the echo of that storm carried forward through years of survival. When they separated, her face was wet with tears she did not try to hide, and his throat refused to release anything more than a quiet breath. Behind her, the soft movement of figures filled the doorway with warmth and careful distance. Margaret stood just inside with both hands pressed over her mouth in open emotion. A man rested one arm around her shoulders, steady and protective. A small child peeked carefully from behind Emily's leg, eyes wide and curious, studying Keanu with unguarded seriousness. Emily reached down and brushed her daughter's hair back gently, her voice unsteady as she spoke his name out loud for the first time in 14 years, not as memory now, but as truth standing in front of her. They stepped inside together as if crossing a quiet threshold. Neither of them had words for the warmth of the house, wrapping around the paws, still clinging to their skin. The husband moved forward first, offering his hand with a calm strength that did not seek to impress, only to welcome, introducing himself softly with a voice shaped by patience. Keanu returned the handshake with equal restraint, sensing immediately the kind of man this was, one who had learned to earn trust slowly and keep it fiercely. Margaret finally found her voice and embraced him with both arms, the hug full and unguarded, carrying every unsent thank you she had held back for 14 years. When she pulled away, her eyes searched his face as if to confirm something she had believed through prayer alone. The small girl took a cautious step forward, then curiosity pulling her past hesitation. Emily knelt beside her, whispering something gentle into her ear before nudging her forward with encouragement. The child looked up at Keanu, studying him with the seriousness of someone deciding what kind of truth he belonged to. She asked if he was the man from the storm. Keanu knelt in front of her so their eyes met at the same height, and answered that he was, and that her mother had been the brave one. The little girl considered this carefully before nodding as if it made sense, then reached out and touched his jacket sleeve with reverent curiosity. Laughter trembled through the room, fragile but real, easing the weight just enough for breath to return. They moved into the living room together, the quiet rhythm of family life filling the air through ordinary sounds of footsteps, shifting cushions, and the faint hum of something cooking in the back. Keanu's eyes drifted almost immediately to the far wall where something hung with careful prominence, framed not as decoration, but as memory preserved. He had not yet fully seen it, but his body recognized it before his mind did. His steps slowed without permission, his breath shortening as if the air itself had grown thinner in that corner of the room. The shape inside the frame was unmistakable now, and with it came the silent weight of 14 years, suspended in cloth and glass. He stopped several steps away from the wall, as if crossing the remaining distance required permission. His body was not yet sure it had earned. The jacket rested inside the frame exactly as it had once hung across his shoulders. The same line of wear along the seam, the same soft collapse at the cuffs, now preserved like an artifact of a different life. Emily stood beside him in silence, watching his reaction rather than the jacket itself, her hands folded tightly at her waist as if bracing for something sacred to shift. When he finally moved closer, his chest tightened so abruptly he had to steady himself with one hand against the back of a chair. The room felt smaller now, the walls nearer the air thick with the weight of meaning that no one spoke, but everyone felt. Emily began to explain in a voice barely above breath, telling him how the jacket had followed her through every turning point, how she framed it when she finally believed she would survive, how it had watched over late-night study sessions, first patient breakthroughs, quiet victories no one else saw. Margaret stepped closer and added that it had never been treated as a symbol of him, but as proof of the moment she chose to stay. The husband said nothing, only placed a hand gently on Emily's back, as if anchoring her to the present. The little girl climbed onto the couch and tucked her legs beneath her, watching with wide seriousness, as if aware that something permanent was unfolding. Keanu stared into the glass and saw not fabric, but rain, not thread, but headlights, not memory, but breath returning to a frozen chest. His hands began to tremble without his consent. He pressed his fingertips together as if in prayer, then slowly lifted his eyes to Emily. When he spoke, the words emerged with uneven effort, broken by emotion that refused to be shaped into order. He said that he had never imagined this outcome, never allowed himself to wonder beyond hope that she lived. Emily answered him with a quiet certainty that carried no drama, only truth telling him that she carried his words the way others carry scripture. Not because he was famous or remarkable, but because on that night he listened when no one else had. The room fell into a stillness deeper than silence, holding them in a moment that felt both impossibly long and impossibly brief. Keanu drew one slow breath and looked again at the jacket, realizing with quiet shock that the life it had guarded was no longer only hers, but now echoed through every soul in this room. Dinner unfolded with quiet intention rather than ceremony. The kind of meal shaped more by shared presence than presentation plates passed gently, silverware touching porcelain with soft rhythm. The little girl whispering stories to her mother between bites, while the adults moved slowly through conversation that felt too sacred to rush. Keanu listened more than he spoke at first, absorbing the ordinary sounds of this family at rest, the subtle proof that a life once balanced on an edge had grown roots. It was Margaret who began to speak of Emily's work, not with pride, but with the careful reverence of someone who had watched endurance reshape into purpose. She told him that Emily now worked full-time as a trauma counselor for teens navigating abuse, abandonment, and self-harm, that her calendar was always full, not because she advertised herself loudly, but because young people somehow found her through quiet recommendation and desperate hope. Emily lowered her eyes at that, uncomfortable with the attention, but her husband added details with steady admiration, explaining how she had helped more than 300 teens directly over the past decade, how she stayed late when cases were too heavy to carry alone, how some nights she came home drained but never detached. Keanu felt each number settled differently than accolades ever had, none of it abstract, every life attached to breath and heartbeat. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm but layered with old memory, explaining how she had begun by volunteering at a crisis line years earlier, unsure if she was strong enough to sit with other people's darkness when she was still learning to survive her own. She said that the first time a trembling voice on the other end of the line whispered that they wanted to disappear, she almost hung up in fear, not of them, but of the mirror they held to who she once was. She stayed because she remembered the storm, because someone once stayed with her when leaving would have been easier. The table fell into a listening silence as the ordinary room began to hold extraordinary weight. Keanu sat with his hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes lowered, feeling the unfamiliar tension of gratitude braided with disbelief. The child laughed softly at something small on her plate, unaware of the invisible bridge stretching across time above the table as Emily's life began to unfold in full view for the first time. 4. As plates gradually emptied and the quiet comfort of food settled into stillness, Emily began to speak with a steadier confidence, not as the girl from the storm, but as the woman who had learned to move inside other people's storms without losing herself. She told Keanu about the statewide counseling programs. She helped develop initiatives that brought trauma support directly into schools and shelters where teens rarely trusted anyone in a position of authority. She explained how many of those teens would never walk into a clinic by choice, how shame and fear kept them hidden, and how she learned to meet them where they already were. In classrooms, in shelters, in probation offices, in the quiet corners of youth centers where pain learned to stay quiet. She spoke about standing at podiums in gymnasiums and multi-purpose rooms, looking out at rows of tired young faces, telling them that survival was not weakness and that asking for help was not failure. Margaret listened with quiet tears as memories aligned with outcomes she had prayed for without ever predicting. Emily's husband described the nights when Emily returned home carrying stories she could not speak aloud, yet how she sat at the kitchen table in silence before finally sleeping, and how she returned again the next morning without hesitation. Keanu felt the echo of that relentless return inside his own chest, a repetition of stopping, of choosing, again and again to stay when leaving would be easier. Emily admitted that she often told teens about the night on the highway without using Keanu's name, framing it only as a stranger who listened when the world felt deaf. She said some of those teens later became volunteers themselves, passing the same language forward, translating pain into permission to remain. As she spoke, her daughter listened with wide focus, absorbing pieces without fully understanding them, learning quietly who her mother was beyond the bedtime stories. Keanu stared at the table for a long moment, feeling the weight of the unseen architecture built upon one unplanned choice. He said nothing, yet only listened as if he were a witness in a room that existed because a storm once demanded attention. Emily finished this part of her story with a breath that held no pride, only responsibility, and the room sat with the enormity of it without searching for applause. The final weight of it arrived not through numbers or programs, but through one simple sentence. Emily spoke so quietly, it almost slipped beneath the sound of breathing around the table. She looked at Keanu, then with eyes steady and unguarded, and told him that every time she saved someone, he had saved them first. The words did not land like praise. They landed like truth. The air shifted in the room, thickening with a meaning no one tried to soften. Keanu felt a physical heat surge behind his eyes, as if something deep inside him had been struck with gentle force. He tried to answer, but the first attempt failed him. When his voice returned, it came low and uneven, carrying neither denial nor acceptance, but something closer to awe. He told her that he did not feel like the beginning of anything, that he remembered only a frightened girl and a long wait beside the road. Emily replied that beginnings rarely recognize themselves when they happen. The little girl leaned against her mother's arm, then small and warm, and unaware that her life was being traced backward through a stranger's memory. Margaret pressed a hand flat to her chest, breathing as if the years had suddenly leaned forward, all at once. Emily's husband lowered his eyes with quiet respect, understanding that this moment belonged to something older than him and larger than any one of them. Keanu finally lifted his gaze toward Emily again and told her that she did the saving, that he only stood in the rain with her. Emily shook her head slowly, a small certainty shaping her expression, answering that sometimes standing is the hardest rescue of all. No one spoke after that. The table held them in a stillness that did not feel empty. It felt full. Outside, the night settled deeper against the windows, the quiet wrapping the house, the way presence wraps memory. Keanu sat with his hands folded, humbled by a count of lives he would never meet, yet now somehow carried within him. The storm on the highway had long passed. The echoes of it had not. After dinner, the adults lingered quietly in conversation, while Emily's daughter drifted toward the open space of the living room floor with crayons and paper, her small world unfolding in careful color. Keanu noticed her watching him between strokes, curiosity returning in gentle waves as if she were still deciding who he was to her. He moved closer without interrupting her work and sat on the floor a short distance away, close enough to be present without intruding. She glanced up again and this time did not look away. She asked if he had ever been scared in a storm. He answered that he had many times, that storms could be loud and confusing and scary when you were caught inside them. She frowned thoughtfully at her drawing, then said her mother told her storms were not forever. The words fell from her mouth with the simplicity of a lesson learned by heart. Keanu felt his chest tighten with quiet recognition as he nodded and told her that her mother was right. She added without looking up that her mother said the rain only stayed to make the flowers brave. Keanu exhaled slowly, unsure whether to smile or break beneath the weight of it. He asked her what she was drawing, and she lifted the paper toward him, showing a bright, uneven rainbow stretched across dark blue lines, a small stick figure beneath it with arms raised. She said it was a girl waiting for the rain to finish. Keanu stared at the picture longer than the moment required, seeing not childish color, but a language inherited rather than taught. Emily watched from across the room with quiet stillness, understanding exactly what was happening without needing explanation. Keanu looked back at the child and told her the rainbow was beautiful. She considered that, then leaned toward him and whispered, as if sharing a secret that had been passed down like a promise. She said, "Storms pass." Keanu felt something inside him loosen as the child's whisper settled into the space between them. Not as an echo, but as a continuation, a sentence that had learned to walk on its own. He asked her where she learned those words, and she shrugged with the simple certainty of children saying her mommy said them when the thunder got too loud, or when the house felt too quiet. He nodded slowly, understanding that the lesson had been taught in moments of shaking and moments of silence stitched into the small spaces where fear tries to grow. She told him her mommy said storms were feelings too, and that feelings could be very big, but they always got smaller if you stayed. The phrasing was uneven and imperfect, but the truth inside it was sharp and clear. Keanu looked at Emily across the room, and she met his eyes without distance, aware that something was crossing between past and future through the words of her child. The little girl scooted closer and handed him a crayon without asking blue like the night sky in her drawing. He took it with a quiet smile and added a small line beneath the rainbow, not changing what she had made, but joining it. She watched with careful approval, as if deciding whether he was doing it correctly. When he finished, he returned the paper, and she studied it seriously before nodding once. She told him her name and said his slowly, like it mattered. He repeated hers as gently as possible. Somewhere behind them, the adults continued speaking in low voices, but the room seemed to narrow around this simple exchange. Keanu realized with slow clarity that the words, once spoken in a storm, had crossed into bedtime stories, into whispered reassurances, into the mind of a child who did not know their origin, yet lived by their meaning. He sat quietly in that knowing, not as a triumph, but as a responsibility he had never asked for and could never set down. As the evening thinned toward night, the child leaned against Keanu's knee with the easy trust of someone who had decided he was safe, her fingers still marked with traces of blue and yellow. She asked if storms ever come back after they leave. He answered that sometimes they do, but they never return in the same way, and people grow stronger each time they learn they can survive one. She considered this, then said that her mommy used to cry when thunder came, and now she sings instead. The words struck him with quiet force. He pictured Emily at 17 in the rain, silent and hollow, and then again as a mother at bedtime, teaching steadiness with melody instead of fear. The child asked if he knew her mommy when she was little. He said he did, but only for a short while, and that she was very brave even then. The girl smiled, as if that answered everything. Emily watched from the doorway with her husband's arm around her shoulders, both of them seeing the past and the future gently touching through a living room floor scattered with crayons. Keanu felt the weight of time shift from burden to bridge. When the child pressed her small forehead briefly to his arm, before returning to her drawing, he understood that the ripple had not only moved forward, but had learned to speak in a new voice. The storm no longer traveled as fear, it traveled as language. Later, as coats were gathered and goodbyes prepared, the little girl ran back to him once more and hugged him quick and fierce. She pulled away and said the words again as a promise she meant to keep. Storms pass. Keanu closed his eyes and felt the bridge complete at last breath. The invitation came quietly the next morning, not as a request shaped for ceremony, but as a question spoken with careful humility. Emily asked if he would consider visiting the trauma center where she worked just once, at first to sit with a small group of teens who were struggling in ways she recognized too well. Keanu did not answer right away. The words settled into him slowly, carrying the weight of what that room might hold, of faces that would mirror pain he thought he had already laid to rest. He told her he was not a speaker, not a teacher, not someone trained to guide anyone through darkness. Emily did not argue. She only said that he had once done all those things without knowing it, and sometimes that was the only qualification that mattered. He agreed without certainty, only with the quiet understanding that some doors do not wait for readiness. The center stood at the edge of town beside a line of old trees, its windows soft with muted light, neither welcoming nor cold, simply present. As he walked its hallway beside Emily, the sounds reached him. Before the faces did muffled voices behind doors, the scrape of chairs, the low hum of a place that held stories without advertising them. When they entered the room, the teens were already seated in a loose circle, some slouched with folded arms, others rigid with guarded attention, a few staring at the floor as if hoping not to be seen at all. Keanu felt the echo of Emily everywhere, not in resemblance, but in the familiar geometry of pain. There were angry eyes that dared the world to leave them alone. There were distant eyes that asked to be forgotten. There were hollow eyes that had already started to disappear. Emily introduced him simply, without name or history, only as someone who once stopped for a stranger. Keanu sat down among them, not above them, and for a moment said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough for discomfort to settle, not as tension, but as a test of whether he would rush to fill it. Keanu let it remain. He studied the floor once, then lifted his eyes slowly and told them he had once driven through a storm so hard he could barely see the road, and that he had almost kept driving when he saw a stranded car on the shoulder. He said he was tired, afraid, and thinking only about getting home. He told them he did not sound heroic that night. He sounded human. A boy at the far edge of the circle snorted quietly and crossed his arms tighter. A girl with red knuckles stared harder at the floor. Keanu continued without softening the truth, telling them about the fear in the other car, about the silence that felt heavier than the rain, about the way a stranger's pain can sneak up on you and refuse to be ignored. He did not mention fame. He did not name himself. He spoke only of loneliness, of the ache of not wanting to exist anymore, of the way despair often hides behind quietness. A tall boy finally asked why he stopped if he was afraid. Keanu answered that he did not know for sure, that sometimes the right choice appears before understanding does. Another voice asked if he saved her. Keanu shook his head gently and said, "She saved herself, he only stayed long enough for her to remember how." The anger in the room did not vanish, but it softened around the edges. One girl whispered that storms did not pass for everyone. Keanu met her eyes and told her that storms do not ask permission to hurt people, but they do not get the final word either. The room grew quieter, not from submission, but from recognition. A boy near the corner finally lifted his head and said he had not planned on being here tomorrow. The words did not echo. They landed heavy and vulnerable in a way that made the room hold its breath. Keanu leaned forward slightly and told him that tomorrow did not require bravery, only staying. A girl with bandaged wrists asked what staying looked like when everything inside wanted to leave. He answered that staying sometimes meant sitting in silence until the feeling lost its grip. Another teen said silence made the noise worse, and Keanu nodded as if he had expected that truth. He told them staying could also mean calling someone or breaking something open with words. Emily watched from the back of the room as the shape of the story shifted from memory into living language. The teens began to speak in small fragments, not confessions, but openings. Anger shared space with exhaustion, fear with stubborn defiance. Keanu listened without fixing, without guiding, without offering answers shaped like slogans. He only repeated that none of them were invisible in that room. When the session ended, no one rushed for the door. A few lingered as if the room itself had become a place that could breathe with them. As Keanu finally stood, one quiet voice thanked him for staying even when nothing had changed yet. He answered that some changes move first in the dark before they ever show their faces. Outside the window, the sky hung low and pale. Keanu left the room knowing the storm was not behind them, but it no longer traveled alone now. The room had nearly emptied when Keanu noticed the boy still seated near the back, shoulders slumped forward, as if gravity itself had found a permanent hold on him. The others drifted out slowly, some glancing back with uncertain expressions, but the boy did not move. Keanu remained where he was, packing nothing, waiting without making it obvious that he was waiting for him. After several long moments, the boy finally spoke, his voice barely rising above the hum of the lights. He said he was supposed to be dead last night. Keanu did not react outwardly, did not interrupt, did not ask for more than the boy was already giving. The boy explained that he had a plan, that he had counted the seconds. The way some people count prayers, that he had written messages he never sent. He said it calmly, without drama, as if describing a schedule that had simply fallen apart. Keanu felt the familiar chill of recognition run through his chest. Not panic, not shock, but the quiet terror of knowing exactly how close that edge stands to ordinary breath. The boy told him he came to the session only because a staff member insisted, only because he did not have the energy left to argue. He admitted that hearing someone speak without trying to fix him made something pause inside his head for the first time in weeks. Keanu asked his name. The boy gave it quietly and waited as if expecting it to change nothing. Keanu repeated it with care, not as a technique, but as a way of saying that it now existed between them. The boy stared at his hands and said he did not want to die anymore, but did not know how to live either. Keanu answered that not knowing how to live was not the same as wanting to leave. It only meant the map had not been drawn yet. Keanu leaned against the table and told him there was no deadline for becoming okay. The boy said deadlines were all he understood, and that tomorrow felt louder than fear. Keanu said tomorrow could be borrowed instead of faced, and borrowed time belonged to him. The boy asked what to do when night returned, and his thoughts sharpened like knives. Keanu answered that he once waited with someone until help arrived, and so could he. The boy shook his head and said he had no one waiting with him anymore. Keanu reached into his pocket slowly, as if respecting the moment before breaking it now. He took out a small card and wrote a number with deliberate, careful strokes slowly. The boy watched the numbers appear as if they were something fragile being assembled together. Keanu said this was not a promise of answers, only a promise of someone staying. The boy asked if he could call even in the middle of the night again. Keanu said especially then, because storms prefer the dark when people feel alone most often. The boy's hands shook as he took the card and folded it with surgical care. He said no one had ever trusted him with that kind of permission before tonight. Keanu replied that trust grows in places where fear once built its strongest walls inside. The boy nodded, as if trying the idea on without fully believing it, yet somehow. Keanu told him he did not have to decide anything beyond the next breath alone. The boy whispered that he could manage one breath and maybe another afterward if possible. The hallway lights dimmed as staff prepared to close the room for the night shift. Keanu stood and waited while the boy placed the card into his pocket with care. The boy stood slowly and hesitated once, as if deciding whether belief was safe to carry yet. He said he would try to stay tonight. Keanu answered that trying was enough for now. They walked to the doorway together and stopped where the hall light softened into shadow. The boy turned back once and asked if history really repeated. little. Keanu said only if someone was willing to walk first. The boy nodded, as if storing the idea somewhere hidden. When he left, Keanu remained standing a moment longer, understanding with quiet certainty that the storm had begun its echo forward. Keanu returned the following month without announcement, without schedule, shared beyond a few quiet confirmations between him and Emily, his presence slipping into the building as gently as breath. No cameras followed him, no names were spoken for attention. The teens did not know his past, only that he came back. That was what mattered. He sat with new faces each visit, and some familiar ones who had survived another 30 days. The room changed every time, but the pain did not. It only wore different voices. Some teens cursed through their fear. Some stayed silent and unreachable. Some asked questions that trembled beneath bravado. Keanu never prepared speeches. He only told the truth of staying. He learned quickly that presence could not be rushed, and that trust arrived only when it was not hunted. Emily watched him move through these circles with quiet respect, knowing he carried nothing of the world he came from inside these walls. The staff noticed something shift, even when no miracles announced themselves. More teens stayed after sessions, more eyes lifted from floors. The changes were small but real. Still, the losses came too. 1 month a seat remained empty where a boy once sat. No explanation was offered at first. Later, Emily told him quietly that the boy had not survived the week. Keanu did not speak for a long time after hearing it. The weight of that absence followed him through the day like a shadow that would not detach. That night, he sat alone in the truck and felt the familiar whisper of failure crawl into his chest. He had believed without realizing it that staying meant saving. The truth cut deeper. Staying meant witnessing whether the saving came or not. When he returned the following month, the empty chair remained empty. He sat anyway. He stayed anyway. The mission did not reshape itself into heroics. It narrowed into endurance. With each return, the room grew heavier, not with despair, but with memory, every face carrying echoes of those who had been there before, those who left walking, and those who left carried. Keanu learned the names slowly, never forcing them into permanence, but holding them with respect while they were entrusted to him. Some teens laughed 1 week and vanished the next without explanation. Some returned thinner, quieter, angrier, yet still returned. He learned not to praise survival as victory, but to treat it as labor, unseen and exhausting. One girl, who once spoke in long, defiant bursts, came back unable to meet his eyes and asked only if storms ever learned new tricks. He answered that storms change shape, but not purpose, and that people change shape too when they endure them. Another month, a boy he barely remembered stopped him at the door and said the only reason he kept coming was because Keanu still did. The statement struck him with quiet force. He realized then that returning had become its own language, a vow spoken without ritual. Yet the grief kept pace with the work. He attended one memorial at the edge of town, without fanfare, standing at the back, with Emily as a name he once heard in a whisper was spoken aloud for the last time. The weight of those moments followed him home and into sleep. He dreamed often of the highway rain and woke with the familiar guilt that no amount of presence could undo every ending. He struggled with the truth that some storms did not pass in time. On those nights, he questioned whether staying only prolonged suffering. Emily reminded him that leaving would not spare it either. The work did not promise fairness. It only offered communion. Keanu returned again after those doubts. The fear of losing them did not outweigh the fear of abandoning those still alive. With each month, his voice grew quieter, his listening deeper. He did not become stronger. He became steadier. And in that steadiness, something fierce and human continued to breathe. The losses never taught him to leave. They taught him how to arrive with less illusion and more truth. Keanu stopped expecting outcomes and began offering only presence. Some months ended in quiet relief. Some ended in silence that felt too heavy to name. He carried both the same. The work did not grow lighter, but it grew real. He did not save everyone. He did not even save most. But he learned that staying was not about victory. It was about refusing to let someone face the storm alone when the rain returned. Years passed without announcement, the way real change often does, quietly weaving itself into places that once only knew silence. The boy who stayed behind after the first session no longer sat in folding chairs beneath humming fluorescent lights. He stood now at the front of small rooms with the same careful stillness Keanu once carried, speaking not as a survivor who had escaped the storm, but as someone who had learned how to walk inside it without drowning. He did not use Keanu's name when he spoke of that night, only said that someone once believed he could borrow tomorrow. That sentence alone became the beginning for others. Emily watched his growth with the same measured pride she once carried for herself, not as ownership, but as witness to a future that had learned how to breathe on its own. Other teens followed different paths. One became a peer advocate in juvenile shelters. Another started a support circle at a trade school. A girl who once would not lift her eyes above her shoes began speaking to classrooms about panic and shame with steady courage. None of them called it a movement. They called it staying. The jacket continued to travel without ever leaving its frame. Its image moved instead, copied into brochures, stitched into quiet logos, inside counseling centers, printed in softened ink on program walls where teens waited their turn to be seen. It was never labeled with celebrity or origin. It carried only one line beneath it: someone stayed. At school assemblies, Emily's daughter stood on a stage, too big for her small body, and spoke into microphones taller than her shoulders. She did not tell the story as history. She spoke it as inheritance. She told rooms full of restless children that feelings were storms, and storms passed if you did not run into them alone. Teachers cried in the back rows, and counselors pressed hands to mouths they forgot to close. Keanu watched these changes from a distance he never tried to cross. The circle had outgrown his hands. Time carried the work forward with a patience no one could rush, and the growing web of quiet advocates learned to recognize one another without badges or slogans. The boy who once hid at the back of the room earned his certification and took his first position at a coastal center 2 blocks from where he used to wander at night, tracing familiar streets with a new purpose that did not erase memory but guided it. He learned how to listen the way he once needed to be heard, letting people arrive at their own words without pulling them into shape. Emily returned to classrooms where she had once sat trembling and now stood steady, introducing students to the language of feelings as if it were a second alphabet they had always known but never named. Her daughter grew into the role of messenger without being burdened by it, learning when to speak and when to laugh, when to carry the story and when to set it down. Across town, a youth shelter painted a small jacket on the wall near the intake desk after a staff member heard the story and asked permission to honor it simply as an emblem of staying. Soon another center did the same, then another, until the image became a quiet thread, linking spaces that had once felt isolated from one another. Keanu learned about these echoes not through headlines, but through brief messages from Emily, single sentences sent late at night or early in the morning, updates offered without expectation. He never visited those rooms as a figure. He walked past as a neighbor, as a man in a cap buying coffee, as a presence that did not require recognition to matter. The circle widened quietly, moving outward without ever turning back again. They did not measure success by numbers anymore, but by continuity, by how many hands reached for other hands without being told. The jacket remained framed in Emily's living room, unchanged by time, while its meaning traveled farther than any of them could follow. Keanu marked the years not by milestones, but by names he never forgot. Some wrote to him when they graduated, some when they stumbled, some never again. He kept each memory without sorting victory from loss. The storm no longer felt like a single night. It felt like a river that had learned to make land. The letter arrived without warning on an ordinary afternoon that carried no sense of ceremony, resting among folded flyers and quiet mail as if it were nothing more than another piece of paper passing through time. Keanu noticed it because it was handwritten, the envelope slightly uneven, as though the sender's hand had trembled while forming each line. He sat at the kitchen table for a long moment without opening it, feeling the familiar tension that came whenever the past knocked gently instead of loudly. The return address stopped him first. It was from the coastal town near the center, a place he had learned to carry in his chest without naming it. When he unfolded the paper, the ink inside was steady, despite the weight of its words. The boy wrote that he was 23 now. He wrote that he had finished school. He wrote that he still kept the card in his wallet, even though the edges had worn soft from time. He wrote that there were nights he still heard the dark speak, but there were more nights now when he heard his own voice answer back. The line that shifted the room arrived quietly in the middle of the page without drama around it. He wrote that he did not die because Keanu stopped. The sentence lodged in Keanu's chest with a force that made him grip the table without realizing it. The boy continued saying that he never called the number, but knowing it existed had changed how the night sounded. He said that sometimes staying came down to believing someone would answer even if you never tested the line. Keanu read the sentence again and again, as if repetition might make it lighter. It only made it deeper. Outside the window, the day moved on without noticing that a tide had quietly reached its highest mark within a man who once thought he had only stood still beside a road. He folded the letter once then again, not as an ending but as a way of holding it, and the room seemed to narrow to the simple fact of breath moving in and out of his chest. He thought of the boy's hands shaking as he took the card, of the hallway lights dimming, of a promise shaped without witnesses. He thought of Emily at 17 in the rain, and of her daughter counting crayons on the floor. The connecting lines no longer felt theoretical. They felt physical. He carried the letter with him through the house, set it beside the framed jacket, and stood there a long while without touching either. The sentence repeated inside him with a quiet insistence that did not ask for agreement. It only asked for acknowledgement. He had learned over the years that gratitude could feel heavier than sorrow because it asked you to accept what mattered. He sat and wrote back without searching for the right words. He told the boy he was glad he stayed. He told him that hearing he stayed would help others stay too, even if neither of them ever met those people. He told him that the card had never been a tether but a doorstep, and that he had walked through it on his own. When he finished, he signed only his first name the same way he always had in rooms where names were meant to be small. He sealed the envelope and felt an unfamiliar calm. Not relief, not completion, but the steady recognition that the work had moved beyond his reach without leaving him behind. At dusk, he stepped outside and listened to the wind move through the trees like distant rain. For the first time in many years, the sound did not pull. That night, he slept without the familiar restlessness that usually followed memory, as if something long unfinished had finally learned how to rest without closing. In the dark, he did not see the highway or the rain. He saw only the slow widening of water as it reached shore after shore without stopping for permission. He understood at last that the ripple had never belonged to him. It had borrowed him for one moment and then chosen to live on its own. The boy's sentence returned again and again, not as a burden, not as praise, but as a quiet truth that asked to be carried forward without ceremony. He did not die because you stopped. Keanu whispered the words once into the empty room, not in disbelief, not in triumph, but in recognition of something larger than gratitude. The storm had not ended when the rain did. It had only changed shape and learned how to move through other lives without losing its source. He rose before dawn, made coffee, and watched the sky lighten without asking it for meaning. The tide had already arrived. Now it simply moved. Keanu stood beside his truck again, years later, in the same quiet posture he once held without meaning. The metal cool beneath his palm, the night wide and unhurried around him. The air carried no storm now, only the soft distance of waves and wind and traffic far away. Yet the memory of rain still lived inside his bones as clearly as if it had never dried. He thought of the letter resting folded in his pocket, and the number that had once been written on a card with no certainty attached to it. He thought of how close he had come to choosing the easier road that night, how close he had come to mistaking motion for escape. He almost drove past, The words moved through him without accusation. Only truth. He almost chose silence. He almost chose convenience. The world would never have known what it lost. A girl once frozen in despair would have disappeared into a dark that asked nothing back. A future mother would have vanished before her child ever learned to speak. A room of trembling teens would have remained unnamed and unseen. The echo did not accuse him. It instructed him. He leaned his head briefly against the door of the truck and breathed in the simplicity of metal and night and stillness. He had not known what staying would cost him. He had not known what leaving would have taken from others. He knew only that one decision had unfolded into lives he would never be fully able to imagine. He did not feel pride. He felt responsibility, the quiet kind that does not demand witness. He had not rescued a story. He had stepped into it long enough for it to keep walking without him. Somewhere out there, Emily tucked her child into bed. Somewhere out there, the boy unlocked a center in the early morning hours. Somewhere out there, storms still came. And somewhere someone stood at the edge of a choice that looked ordinary from the outside. Keanu stayed by the truck as if the years had folded into a single moment. The pocketed letter warm against his chest, with the weight of words that had learned how to travel alone. He counted not the nights he returned to that center, but the ones he almost did not. The thin margins where courage hides inside hesitation. He almost chose convenience again and again in different shapes and different towns, and each time staying asked for something new. It asked for time when time felt scarce. It asked for listening when answers would have felt cleaner. It asked for bearing witness when turning away would have been painless. He learned that presence is not grand. It is repetitive. It shows up after fatigue and still knocks. He learned that you cannot carry every life, but you can carry the choice to meet one when it crosses your path. He learned that hope does not arrive as certainty, but as a small permission to take the next breath without apology. Around him, the night moved with ordinary patience. A car passed. A light clicked off in a distant window. The world kept its rhythms without needing his permission. He thought of the first jacket hanging in a living room, far away of paint, on shelter walls, of voices that now answered other voices. None of it bore his name. All of it bore a decision. He felt the strange relief of knowing that the legacy had never required him to be larger than human. It only required him to remain human when it would have been easier to disappear into the road. He closed his eyes and pictured the highway once more, not as fear, but as a line that had been crossed in both directions by countless feet. He opened the truck door but paused before getting in, letting the lesson settle without rushing past it. You never know whose storm you are standing beside. The question lingered quietly in the air as he looked down the empty road and asked himself how many lives shift because of one ordinary pause. Have you ever been that pause for someone? Or has someone been it for you? If you have a story, share it and let others borrow your courage. Keanu drove off without spectacle, only with the steady belief that kindness does not need noise to move mountains.